So for today's Moravian text reading, we are in 1 Corinthians 14, verse 6 to 19. This is a classic passage for the Pentecostals, the Charismatics. I grew up in the Pentecostal church, in Pentecostalism. I went to a Pentecostal Bible college, and what all good Pentecostals know from this passage is that when it comes to spiritual gifts, the big question, the primary question is not how do we receive the gifts or what are the gifts. The primary question is how do we use them in a way that honours God and blesses others in community together. That is the big question. That's the problem that the Corinthian church was experiencing. They knew all about the gifts, they operated in the gifts, but they didn't know how to use them together in community in a healthy way. And it's important because in today's world, today's culture of self-actualization, where the priority is how I as an individual grow and develop, how has God gifted me? How can I grow my giftedness? How can I use my gifts for my own, I suppose, sense of fulfillment? We've got to remember what we've been reading, 1 Corinthians 12, 13 and 14, that we are gifted for the benefit of others. We are gifted for the benefit of the body. And one of the examples Paul uses here is the gift of tongues. He says that when I speak in tongues, what it does is it edifies me, it builds me up. That word edify, used quite a lot in Corinthians, quite a lot in this passage. Ekodemeo, the building up of a house. It's about a community thing, us together. When I speak in tongues, it builds me up, it edifies me, it blesses me. But when it's interpreted, then it blesses others, then it builds others up, like prophecy does. And the church in Corinth, well, they were clearly very supernaturally minded, clearly had a real desire for spiritual gifts, clearly had the teaching on spiritual gifts, clearly had the faith to step into spiritual gifts and access spiritual gifts. Paul says you're eager to do that. And yet, what did they lack? They lacked expressing their giftedness through love. That's why we get this passage, 1 Corinthians 13, sandwiched between chapter 12 and 14. And Paul says without love it is just noise. I don't know about you, but I've been in some noisy collective times of Christians together edifying themselves, and we're called to bless one another for the edification of one another. I think it's also worth pointing out that Paul is distinguishing here between the gift of tongues for personal use, for personal edification, and for corporate use. So in that list in 1 Corinthians 12, gifts of revelation, wisdom, knowledge, healing, discerning of spirits, speaking in tongues, that is a gift that comes upon an individual for the body and needs to be interpreted, as we'll see later on in 1 Corinthians 14. Paul says, in the church, if then prophesy, use gifts for edification. So there are gifts that bless us outside of the church, and tongues is one of those gifts that I use. Paul says I speak in tongues more than all of you. I took that as a challenge to increase my speaking in tongues when I walk the dog each day. But when it's corporate, it needs to be interpreted. So the first thing I'm taking away from this passage is your giftedness is for the benefit of others. And of course, as we use it for others, it blesses us. We get blessed in the wake of that. And secondly, just read 1 Corinthians 14 and ask the question, what sort of communities, what did church look like for these Corinthians? It was clearly church in the home, church in small groups. Otherwise, you can't outwork his instructions for spiritual gifts if you scale it up into the big groups. So this 1 Corinthians 14 dynamic is the small scale dynamic. And of course, we've missed that with COVID, haven't we? Been in one another's homes to worship in the homes together. We met as SLT just the other day to worship together, and just a handful of us, 8 of us, messages in tongues, interpretations, prophecies, words of knowledge and wisdom, gifts of faith for healing, just that dynamic of blessing one another with those gifts. But I suppose what I want to say from this passage is that as we start to gather together, and as we start to think, I'm so excited to get together with God's people, it will bless me. Yes, it will. But let's take the mature approach that we go to gather to bless others. We go to edify others, to serve others, and we get blessed in the wake of that. That's the measure of maturity, the way of love.